or something that you pull the Bible up. I have to say that because you can use your phone. I have it on my phone. So let's say that what we're about to do is the activity of better understanding the term sacrifice. Because what God has led me to is to talk about sacrifice in my sermon. So if I'm going to talk about sacrifice in my sermon, then that means I need to really hone in on that word. I don't need to just go to Webster's dictionary and have a definition for sacrifice and let that be it. No, I don't need to just do that. I don't need to just do that. I'm going to talk about sacrifice like the Lord told me to. So I'm going to put that in the middle. So I'm going to put the word sacrifice in the middle. I told you all this is quite a process. You have to be able to answer those 3 questions in the beginning of this if you're going to commit to the work of exegesis. So the word that God gave me is for, I'm saying the topic or what I'm talking about in my sermon is sacrifice. Well, the scripture that the Lord led me to is Romans 12:1. Now, since God led me to Romans, and God is saying to me that this sacrifice is the main view or point of my sermon, I'm going to put that word there. I got the scripture. Now, for me, I happen to have, again, books. I happen to have some commentaries for the books of the Bible. And a writer in particular that I appreciate is William Barclay. William Barclay breaks these things down in a way that is not, you know how sometimes you read books and they use these really big words and you have to go look up the word in order to read the book. So then it takes you 30 minutes to get through one paragraph. He does not write that way. So I appreciate that. So, if the Lord leads me to Romans, I have here the letter to the Romans. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read that text, and like I said earlier, I'm going to read the entire thing. Now, I need to read the whole book of Romans. We know that we need to read the Bible. We need to read it. We don't need to just read it because we're preparing a sermon. Because someone may never ask me to preach at their church, I'm saying. Someone may never ask me to preach at their church. So does that mean that I'm not motivated to read scripture because nobody asked me to preach and I'm a preacher? The fact is, I was a Christian before I was a preacher. I don't know about you, but I was a Christian before I was a preacher. And Christians are supposed to read the Bible. And so, I need to make sure that I'm constantly reading. So then I read Romans, to understand, who wrote it, Paul, what's the conditions, all those things. But then once I get to this 12, then God is saying sacrifice. So I'm going to look at my commentary, and I'm going to look at my other tools. But word study is so important, and there's a few steps to word study. So the first thing, we need to understand, see how this word was used at the time, so that I can understand the different ranges available to the author. Like what were the different ways in which the word sacrifice was used in Paul's time. So I need to think in terms of circles, and that's what we're about to do. So I'm going to start with the book itself and what sacrifice means for the book of Romans. Then I'm going to move on, and I have it on this thing, I can hardly see it here. Then I'm going to move on to my next circle. So that's the first circle. Then I'm going to move on to this next circle right here. And what I'm going to ask myself is, what other occurrences are there where this word was used by this author? So it's going to be that says other occurrences in Pauline writings. So, or Pauline letters, I should say. And so on there, I have some answers there. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 18, he talks about sacrifice there. And then again, in Ephesians 5 and 2. Because again, what I'm trying to do is get into the mind of Paul when he's talking about sacrifice. Because when I'm talking about sacrifice, it may just be, I felt sick this morning, but I got up and went to work anyway. That's sacrifice. That's the depth of sacrifice for me. And if I'm not careful, I'll get up there and I'll tell everybody else that that's the depth of sacrifice for you. And my depth of sacrifice is as deep as a kid pool. So what is Paul talking about? Not what I'm talking about. So it's also, so there it is. So those are some examples of where it is in Pauline letters, sacrifice. Okay, so next I'm going to move on. And where are other occurrences of this term, sacrifice, in the Testament that I'm in? I'm in the New Testament. So what other occurrences in the New Testament do I find sacrifice? Again, as you're preparing the sermon, you are not going to tell people all of this. It's not about telling people everything. It's about telling yourself. Because you have to live what you preach. And you can live it a little better if you understand a little more. And you certainly can preach it better if you understand a little more. So I'm going through this exegetical process. And what I find is that in the New Testament, sacrifice is talked about in Matthew, Luke, the book of Acts, Hebrews. And this is where the internet can come in pretty handy. Because more than likely, you're not going to have the time or the energy, because you're human, I'm human, to go through the Bible and point every single one of these things out. But you can go online and you can find these scriptures and then go read them. So we're living in a great age. Dr. Taylor told us, he said, it's quite a time that you all are living in. I remember times in the library doing things that you don't have to do these days. Yeah. I never really thought about it like that until he said that. You know, because he was from the time of, the Dewey Decimal System and all those kinds of things. Yeah, so he didn't have that, but we have it. That's why this may sound like a lot, but you're not having to do it in, Dr. Taylor was born in 1918. You don't have to do it in that time. You're doing it in 2016. We can give God that time. Yes. So other occurrences in the New Testament. And then, my last circle here, I'm going to look at the other testament, which is going to be, since I'm in Romans, I'm in the New Testament. So I'm going to look at other occurrences in the Old Testament. Because, like Dr. Taylor said, there ought not be a breach in Scripture. So you have to read it all. It's a book. Read it together. And I also have, in this particular book that I was sharing with you, this pocket guide to the Bible, it actually gives you Jesus in every book of the Bible. Jesus in Genesis. Jesus in, because as Dr. Taylor said, the Old Testament is Jesus concealed. The New Testament is Jesus revealed. So in this book, you see Jesus in every single one. It gives it to you. It says here, Jesus in Mark, Jesus is the Son of God and a wonder worker. This portrait would have appealed to the Romans, who had many stories of gods or outstanding people appearing and working miracles. However, none would have ever allowed themselves to be crucified. The humility and servant nature of Jesus and his role as a redeemer was unique. That's what you see about Jesus in Mark. Yes. So we can go to the Old Testament to see what they said about sacrifice, because we know that the priests they sacrificed in the Old Testament. Then we know that Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice in the New Testament. So we look at that. So we're better understanding this term sacrifice. So after you look at the Old Testament, the last thing is to expand your search to other sources, and this is where we get into ancient and classical literature, apocrypha, and all those kind of things. Maybe you've heard of that. Let's move to that. Ancient and Jewish Christian literature. So remember when I was talking about the literal and or the original, and I was talking about that the Old Testament was written in Hebrew and the New Testament was written in Greek. You know, well, there are a lot of other sources, even outside of the Bible, that can help us when we're doing word study or complete study of the Bible. Maybe you've seen one of these Bibles, the New Oxford Annotated Bible. It's a wonderful Bible because it has there all of these annotations down at the bottom, like to guide you and things like that, almost like a commentary. But it also has apocrypha in there. Now let's talk a little bit. I'm not going to talk about all of these, but I have them there so that, and this is not a complete list either, but if you're doing exegesis and you want to really go out there you go. So let's just look at apocrypha. So in this, apocrypha means hidden. That's what it means, hidden. Apocrypha means hidden. I'm going to read something to you about this apocrypha so I stay on track. During the period between the completion of the Old Testament and the first writings included in the New Testament, many essays, songs, and historical accounts circulated throughout the synagogues and early churches. Some of these documents gradually came to be regarded by certain of the believers as actually inspired and deserving a place in the canon. Okay? There were Christians who regarded some other readings as important as well, and so the Apocrypha is placed in this particular book here. Apocrypha is like First and Second Maccabees, which talks about a family and their struggle. It has different stories in there that some people deem to be valid, but other people say, well, no, in the New Testament, none of the apostles even talked about any of those books. They never alluded to it or anything like that. So they don't deem it as important. But then there are other people who say, well, because one of them in here is the words of Solomon. And so when you read these particular texts, you just have to pray to God and say, Lord, what is it that you would have me get out of this? But it is available to us, just like all this other stuff is available to us. So the work of exegesis means that you know that all of these different sources are available. You may not know a lot about them. I can't remember half of this stuff I'm sitting here. So I would have to go back and reread a lot of it, to be honest, and that's what I do. I mean, that's what the preacher does. You stick with it, like Dr. Taylor said. So you just stick with it. You don't have to remember everything, but you do have to know that there are resources and know where to go to get it. And if someone asks you a question and you don't have an answer right away, that's okay. You say to them, I'm going to look into that and I'm going to get back to you. Every time I do a workshop, I don't know everything. People ask me questions, and I don't know. But I'm okay with not knowing, because God didn't create me to know everything. God created me to chase after Him. That's why I'm here. Not to impress you with what I know or what I don't know. So what I do is, I think about the question, I'm like, wow, I don't try to create something, you know, but I think about it and I go research it. I'm a researcher. That's what I do. That's why I got a PhD. Because that's what I do. I research. I'm cool with that. That's what you do. You stick with it. You stay at it. This is not something to be mastered. That's why I love it so much. So many other occupations or things that people do, they're the very best at it. I don't ever plan to be the very best. I just pray that God gives me another chance. God, give me